Hello and welcome to Miss Hannah Loves Grammar. In this video we'll be concentrating on Sonnet 29, otherwise known as I Think of Thee, by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. So Elizabeth Barrett Browning is a Victorian poet and she married Robert Browning. Her literary reputation surpassed his in their lifetime. Another thing to note about her is that she had very severe health problems across her life and fell foul of a very controlling father who believed she should stay with the family. And in fact, when she married Browning, her father disowned her completely. She was also raised a devout Christian, and this permeates in lots of the imagery she chooses to use, which is religious, across her poetry. So Barrett Browning wrote Sonnet 29 as a private way of showing and recording her love for Robert Browning when they first began courting. It's believed that even he didn't see this poem until they got married, and then she shared all the poems with him. Now, Robert believed these were the best sonnets in the English language, and he absolutely encouraged her to publish them. Now, she was a private woman, and to keep it distant from her personal life, Elizabeth published the collection of sonnets as Sonnets from the Portuguese, as if she were translating an odd set of foreign poems from Portugal, when in actual fact they were her originals. So when we look at the title, Sonnet 29, I Think of Thee, I Think of Thee highlights that this poem is about infatuation and how intense our thoughts can be, and Sonnet 29 simply refers to the fact it's that number within the collection. It's a deeply private poem, and we can be more clear of this as Barrett Browning's own feelings rather than a more distant speaker based on the history of this poem. But let's examine it together. I think of thee. My thoughts do twine and bud about thee as wild vines about a tree. Put out broad leaves, and soon there's naught to see, except the straggling green which hides the wood. Yet, oh, my palm tree, be it understood, I will not have my thoughts instead of thee, who art dearer, better. Rather instantly renew thy presence, as a strong tree should. Rustle thy boughs and set thy trunk all bare, and let these bands of greenery which ensphere thee drop heavily down, burst, shattered everywhere. Because in this deep joy to see and hear thee, and breathe within thy shadow a new air, I do not think of thee, I am too near thee. Barrett Browning chooses to write a Petrarchan sonnet, a very traditional Italian love poem that was very famous across the Renaissance. It contains 14 lines and 10 beats per line, which is significant because 10 beats is an iambic pentameter, and in this case it seemed to mirror the heartbeat, hence why it's often used in love poems. And a Petrarchan sonnet is containing two key elements, really. An octave, which is the problem, and it's normally the first 8 lines of the poem, and then additionally a sestet, which is the solution to the poem. And then you can often expect to find a volta, which is the turning point in the problem, becoming the solution in the poem. And we'd normally expect to see that between the octave and the sestet, so the octave ends at the end of line 8, and normally we'd expect to see the volta as the sestet begins in line 9. Interestingly enough, though, the urgency of our speaker across this poem means that the volta falls earlier in lines 7 to 8, and that's enjambment, and it shows the impatience of our speaker, rather instantly renew thy presence. And across this whole opening in our octave, we're really aware that our speaker is very overwhelmed by the thoughts that consume them about how much they fancy and really like the look of the person that's in their head. And the exclamation marks, the dashes, the simple monosyllabic words, they help convey the joy and excitement that our speaker feels. As if that weren't enough, the repetition of thee 7 times heightens this very old-fashioned sense of how important the lover is. They're elevated to this spiritual realm, it would seem, where they are put on a pedestal, so special and there to be celebrated. Now, I mentioned earlier that Browning was a devout Christian, so thee has religious connotations of something that's quite holy, and thee is an elevated way of speaking, and it's mentioned 2,700 times in the Bible. So it clearly would have been noted by her as something super spiritual. Additionally, you'll note that the opening of the poem has more than one pause. It pauses the rhythm and it concentrates us on one particular word, thee. I think of thee, then there's the caesura. And then again, the next caesura that we see on line 2 is about thee. And each time it focuses our mind as a reader on thee, the one she likes. Additionally, we're brought into a simile in line 2 of her thoughts like a vine, a wild vine in fact, and the vine is this growth that's binding across the tree and clinging to its bark. So the natural imagery here is presenting this extended metaphor as well across this whole poem of nature consuming her thoughts as if they're a representation of this man who's consuming her thoughts. But actually, she believes that these thoughts that she's having are so tightly woven around a fascination she has with the man that they're not real. It's not a real relationship, it's just infatuation. And this expands itself as we go through to line 5, where it says, "Yet, oh my palm tree." And here it's a biblical reference. It's to a specific book in the Bible called Song of Songs. And it's a moment in the Bible that reads something like this. "Your stature is like a palm tree, and your breasts are like its clusters." So instantly, anybody reading this who read their Bible well, as expected in Victorian times, would understand this is not just physical attraction, it's sexual attraction. And there are more hints to that as we unfold. The notion of twine, wild, trunk, all bare. It would be shocking to Victorian readership, but it definitely has quite significant connotations of sexual interest. So across the octave, as I've already mentioned, the speaker is overwhelmed by their feelings. And it's almost as if their judgment is being clouded by the fantasy of this man. It's straggling green, as it says in lines 4. It's dismissing what could be a fruitful relationship in reality. And the problem is that our speaker doesn't want this to be a fantasy. They want the relationship to be real. And so the hope as we get to the moment of the Volta is for a solution to be found. And the solution is that they rather instantly renew thy presence. And so the solution is for this man to not just be around in her mind, but to be there in actual reality. And as we move through, we also notice the imperative verbs that are littered across the poem. Renew, rustle, drop. Specifically in the sestet, they set the stresses of the force of this love in action. And each time they are the emphasis, and it shows that nothing can stop the renewing of this desire that the speaker has. It's also interesting to acknowledge that as we go through lines 10 to 11, there is enjambement, that means run on line, and it mirrors the way that the leaves are dropping heavy in the sight of this bearing down of this metaphorical depths to their relationship. So here we go. "And let these bands of greenery which ensphere thee drop heavily down, burst, shattered, everywhere." Instantly, the alliteration of plosive sounds between lines 10 and 11 stresses how forcefully the tree is shaking itself in a bid to be different. And then the caesura that we find, that big pause in line 11, between drop heavily down, there's a comma and a dash, that's an automatic pause. It's pushing to the climax with what we hear when it says burst, shattered, everywhere. And that is a huge crescendo. We're really building up to that. We'll notice that burst has 1 syllable, shattered has 2, and then everywhere has 3. And then a hugely emotive exclamation mark. It's the absolute climax of our whole sonnet. The final sentence, though, takes up whole 3 lines with its enjambment, and it's full of very monosyllabic words that are both simple and meaningful and show this huge carefree overflow of emotion. And so if we read it one more time, "Because in this deep joy to see and hear thee, and breathe within thy shadow a new air, I do not think of thee, I am too near thee." So instantly this is a carefree sharing of love as she hopes it to be. And it's interesting, the final line is a reversal completely of the opening of this sonnet. She is imagining him being too near her, when in reality at the moment, as we found at the start of the poem, he's just in her thoughts all the time, not actually physically in reality near her at all. The final word of this sonnet is appropriately the, making an 11th syllable where we would technically, if it's a really tight rhyme scheme for a Petrarchan sonnet, be expecting just 10. And so here we hear something more powerful than anything else we could read in this love poem. Sonnet conventions have been broken. The lover matters more than the style of this poem at all. Love is more important than poetic traditions. So even this very talented poet who knew the rules was able to break the rule to say how much love meant. Now, I don't know whether you loved or loathed this poem, but this form of poetry is very iconic and it's traditional, yet she still breaks the rule to emphasise once more the power of love. And this is definitely a poem about infatuation and the power of the mind when you just can't get that person out of your head. Why not subscribe to Miss Hannah Loves Grammar for all things English, literary and grammatical?